Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast, a show about application development and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. The New Stack's Pancake Breakfast from ContainerCon is brought to you by Apcera and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. The Apcera Trusted Cloud Platform is a highly secure, policy-driven multi-cloud platform for cloud-native applications, containers, microservices, and legacy applications. Apcera enables developers and DevOps teams to use any modern tool or software they want while giving IT and operations teams the assurance that their infrastructure is safe and secure. You can learn more at apcera.com. That's apcera.com. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation is driving adoption of a new computing paradigm that is optimized for modern distributed systems environments, including container packaged, dynamically scheduled, and microservices-based application development operations. You can learn more at cncf.io. That's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at cncf.io. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the New Stack Pancake Breakfast. We started doing these pancake breakfasts about, I think, more than a year ago. And at the time, we just thought it'd be a nice way to get the conference day started. And I'm not sure exactly how we found the pancake robot, or if the pancake robot found us. But we decided that, well, let's buy this pancake robot and see how it works. It's called PancakeBot. And it's been turned into quite an adventure. Joe Jackson, we were having lunch yesterday, and managing editor Joe Jackson said, this has turned into quite something with the pancake robot, because there's all kinds of issues you can tell, like, there's batter consistency issues, there's heat issues, there's pressure issues, all these kind of factors that we never ever expected that we would be dealing with as a technology media organization. But it's a lot of fun, so thank you very much for joining us. So my co-hosts today are Ben Ball, and Ben Ball is a technical editor for the New Stack, and Joe Jackson, managing editor. And here's how we do this. So Ben's making pancakes right now, and if you ask a question, you get a pancake, okay? And because we're in Canada, these are maple leaf pancakes, all right? So
one mantle.
What? And one mantle pancake, the mantle logo for the project. And so I like to have events. I like to make sure that people get the chance to ask a question that they have. And I know sometimes don't feel so great about standing up and asking a question. But this is an opportunity to ask questions really about the topic today, which is really about the state of the container ecosystem, the health of the container ecosystem right now. And before I get started, though, I'd like to introduce the panel, and because these are some people I really respect and glad to have with us. And so I want to start from the very far left. Dan?
Hi there. I'm Dan Kahn. I'm the new executive director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and happy to be here.
Abby Kearns, what am I? Head of Industry Strategy at Cloud Foundry. It is really early this morning.
Hi, I'm David. I'm sitting next to Abby. My name is David Blank-Edelman, and I'm the technical evangelist at a company called Apcera, which is based in San Francisco.
And I'm Sarah Novotny, and I run the open source programs around Kubernetes for Google.
Great. That's excellent. So before we get started, just for people who are not familiar with the New Stack, we are a technology publication. We publish daily. We publish ebooks, and we just published our fourth ebook on Docker Container Ecosystem, which focuses on networking, security, and storage. this event today is one of a series that we do, as I was saying, and we couldn't do it without our sponsors. And I really just want to give a thank you to CNCF and Apcera for making this possible. So a round of applause for those guys. Really appreciate your support. So the topic does today cover the health of the open source container ecosystem. And as we well know, the Docker container ecosystem has just kind of boomed, right? We've really seen it, kind of is like an understatement, right? It has boomed for sure. And now we're getting to this point where, where we started seeing the ecosystem evolve. It was about the container, and it was about that individual container. But developers quickly learned that they could do all kinds of things with this application packaging capability that containers brought. And so now we're talking a lot about orchestration environments, right? And we're seeing a lot of different companies think, okay, well, how can we use containers? How can we develop things? So we saw, for example, Huawei made an announcement yesterday. Apcera has, its own play on things, right? Containers have been around a long time. At the Cloud Foundry Foundation, they've been using a similar kind of a construct to containers for an awfully long time as well. And Sarah is with Google, and we all know that Google has been using containers quite a bit for years.
For a decade.
And they're really the ones who are behind the Kubernetes project. So with that in mind, we are seeing these services evolve that are built on the orchestration platforms themselves. We're seeing containers as a services that are getting developed. And now we're seeing Amazon and Google and all the rest in Azure. The question, though, the question that I have is, like, I'm thinking about this. The great promise was portability, right? And now we're seeing all these different takes on Docker and the container ecosystem. And I'm wondering about what, where is that promise right now? And Sarah and I were talking about this. So maybe, Sarah, you can provide some perspective on that from your point of view about where, what is that promise? And I don't want, we talked about it possibly being a false promise, but I don't think it necessarily is, but I'd like to get your perspective.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about the promise of containers. So much like virtualization before, we had the promise of containers being the atomic unit of application. And for it to be very portable, be able to run it across multiple different container runtimes, container ecosystems, container services. And I think that promise is still out there, and please jump in if you disagree or want to challenge. I think that promise is certainly still out there, but there are a lot of ways in which we're at an inflection point in this ecosystem, trying to make it possible for this to maintain or to remain a discrete unit and an interoperable unit. So there's been work around standardization of the container runtime and the container image through the OCI, which is another sub-project of the Linux Foundation. It's the Open Container Initiative. And there's a lot of work as well around, or a lot of thought around these containers as a service as to how to make sure that we have this portability and make sure that we aren't giving our users ways to, well, I come from the open source side, so I hope that there are ways that we don't cause lock-in even with these container services. But as we talk about containers in enterprise, we need to look at where the lock-in is, even if it's not technology. Maybe it's a skills lock-in. Maybe it's an additional services within a particular cloud platform where you end up locked in. But I think containers is a very important building block in this. But then we also have to look at the broader system. Does anybody else want to talk about this?
David.
Come on.
I think I agree with you. It's an important fundamental for all of the things that cloud promised in 2007. Mm-hmm. I want to elastically scale, and I want to do all the things. And I think that fundamental is that's what containers brought. And I think as we talk about portability and avoiding vendor lock-in, it gives you that promise and that capability. Now, can you go out and lock yourself into a particular vendor or technology? Absolutely.
Very easily.
Absolutely, but I think it gives you that, if you are to follow along with those constructs around cloud native and 12-factor apps and are really thoughtfully and intentionally taking advantage of the abstractions, then you have that portability and you have that fluidity.
David?
So I guess I want to speak to, when I thought of portability, the promise that I was given in 2013 when Docker came out was, I have my developer and she's working on her workstation and I can take her work and toss it right up to production. You know, like here it is, here's the thing, and it can go right up to production. And then I think a few years later we all sat around and said, do I really want to run my developer's workstation in production? That seems like a very bad idea. Maybe we need to think a little bit about what, it's awesome that it's portable, but maybe we want to think a little bit about what's in the container. Maybe we want to think about what that container can talk to, or where is it going to run? You know, that's one of the things that the orchestration platforms, Kubernetes, ours, Cloud Foundry, you know, think a lot about, like, what about placement, or what can it talk to, or what can be in that container? And so I think that the promise of portability is a good one, but I believe that the ecosystem has stepped back a couple of steps and said, oh, well, it's awesome that we can do this, but do we really want to? And I think and the portability that you get from things like the OCI means you could do the right thing to wherever you want to place it, but it's not clear you want to do that. And that sort of decision process of where you want to put things, or what can be in it, what can it talk to, I think is where some of the more interesting work is being done now.
So Dan, this leads to, I think, a good question. And you know, again, Sarah and I were chatting about this beforehand, and you know, first of all, I would love to give you just kind of help people understand what the CNCF is, you know, when you reply. But I also want to talk about, you know, this promise, and part of the promise has to do with how that container is actually constructed, right? It has to do with the image format and how that image format, you know, works in a runtime, right? And the CNCF has to be thinking about this, because you're talking about this programmable infrastructure out that you want everyone to enjoy, right? So I'm curious of, like, you know, what is your view on that promise, and what are you looking for in an image format?
So conveniently, one of the focuses of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is not to think about the image format.
But there's this interdependency, isn't there?
No. Let me give you a little bit more detail than that.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to do is look a little bit more broadly at Cloud Native, and we define that term really with three ideas of containerized, everything we're talking about here, microservices, where once you containerize an app, it makes a lot of sense to split it up into different pieces, have each of those in containers, and then orchestration of how do you work with all those pieces, have them talk to each other, et cetera. And what we have is currently 2 software projects, hopefully soon will be another half or dozen or so, that eventually will make a complete software stack and set of stacks that allow you to deploy cloud native solutions to any public cloud or to a private cloud.
So you have Prometheus, which is what?
Prometheus is a really amazing monitoring app and framework, and Kubernetes are the 2 initial
And you're looking at
software projects.
how many more?
Another half a dozen. NATS from Apcera is high on the list. That's a pub/sub framework. But there's a number of others and I'm happy to walk through them.
Right.
But just for what it's worth, one of the things we're not doing is the image format, partly because that's a tricky and a little bit political. It's also a little bit more standardsy. And so we push that over to another organization called the Open Container Initiative, which is our sister organization, which has extremely overlapping membership, which is also in the Linux Foundation. And they are making great progress and are honing in on version 1.0. But really what that is about is standardizing Docker containers. And so they're taking some features from Rocket. There's a lot of other inputs to it. But at the end of the day, the folks, Docker has taken over the world by storm. I think that I would argue that it's the fastest growing and fastest adopted developer technology in history. And the idea is that when you create one of these Docker images, you want to be able to have confidence that that's going to run reliably, that there's a standard behind it, and then that runtime is also standardized so that you can deploy it anywhere. And so CNCF is trusting OCI, and they're making good headway that they're going to have that standardized format, and that we're using that as the essential building block
The
of
essential
everything that we
building
do.
block. Great.
Let's take a quick break for a message about our sponsor.
At Apsera, we've built a cloud application platform designed to re-energize the enterprise innovation cycle in an entirely new way. A platform that's designed for the widest range of applications, whether old or new or anywhere in between. A platform that works across all your clouds, public and private. A platform with powerful security built in at the core. A platform that delivers trust to the cloud and to your business. Innovation, meet trust. Apsera.
Now, let's get back to the show.
How many people are developing with containers right now? Okay, how many people are actually developers? Good, and how many people are, would you consider yourself have system administration responsibilities or operations responsibilities? Okay, so if you're a developer, can you raise your hand again? All right, I get to pick someone now. This is what I get to do. You knew
This side of the house.
you knew I'd ask you. Do you want a cookie? Do you have any? I mean, so I'm just curious. What are you developing right now? What are you building out?
So we are a build service, and we use containers for our build server. And so it's a unique use case because we have to have sort of short-lived VMs that are instantiated, run the build, give us an exit code if pass or fail, and then shut down. But containers have been immensely helpful for us. And so the next level after that is to sort of look at this ecosystem on the orchestration side and all the other things that are going to come with it. No.
So if you're going to ask a question about where we are with things in the healthy ecosystem, what would it might be?
Just you sort of feel like there's a tyranny of choice, right? This tyranny of this brave new world and a tyranny of choice and how to go about picking that choice, because then it will become a domino effect for possible vendor lock-in or possible things that will make you not have to, you either keep that path forward with the combination that you've chosen, or I want it to be flexible, right, as much as possible, with still having some sort of standard. But yeah, that's why many people are sort of slowly trying to move forward before, charging and without thinking.
Yes, so vendor lock-in, what the hell's different this time?
So I guess I would bounce back to you the tyranny of choice, which is a great description of where we are now. We have so many options that all feed slightly different use cases. As an end user, as an end consumer of this technology, are standards and interoperability something that is more important to you, or is integrated packaged solutions something that is more interesting to you? Is composability, which then belies and encourages the standards and the interoperability. So I think one of the things we're trying to figure out now as an industry and an ecosystem is, what does the end user want and need in a way, and of course there is no one end user, so I'm being a bit provocative here. What does the end user want and need in order to have us help develop the standards or the interoperability or the playbook that says these work together or these pieces are interchangeable, or choose a blue Lego brick to put in this spot here, and here are the different qualities that you have in this orchestration system. Pick from these different qualities, but that plugs in. So I guess I would say we're looking to the end users, the consumers, for a bit of guidance on what they want, just as much as we are trying to dive ahead with setting up things that we think you want. So I guess it's, what kind of feedback can you give us as far as, I heard tyranny of choice, which is a great description. So there's too many options right now. What would help is, maybe we could do a show of hands on this one, is more guidance about composability important to people? Yes, no, maybe a little, okay. Way off, apparently, is more,
I know I said him. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Is more clear, interoperable stacks, so like more of a proscriptive, this is a recommended stack, something that people want? A couple more hands, good, okay.
Great.
Are we looking for lots and lots of configurable Lego bricks? So maybe there are multiple orchestrators or multiple schedulers or multiple container runtimes. Is that useful to people? Again, a few hands. All right.
Build versus buy.
Build versus buy. Another one. Do you want to have to do a lot of heavy lifting, or do you want someone to come in and offer you the soup to nuts solution? Hands. Nobody build. Oh, right, I have to give one option, not two. Right, build.
Right.
Not so much buy. Still not so much. Okay, so I'm going to stop this because clearly I'm not a product person, and we will move on to whatever Alex has next.
Dan, lock in.
Dan, lock in.
I don't have anything to add. But about what?
Lock in.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think that's a lot of what we're doing here, which is it's really easy. I mean, the standard way of doing everything in the past is you pick a vendor that seems, okay, who's the lowest risk company to go with today? I'll adopt their technology, and then it just becomes so incredibly expensive to ever move anywhere else that, you know, maybe 5 years, 10 years down the line for the very next generation of the app or the generation after that, you reconsider it. And so it is a pretty radical concept to say that we think that you could deploy a modern solution where every component of it is open source. Now, we're not locking you into the open source solutions as well. We think companies should be able to come in and compete for any aspect of that, or provide it as a service or provide it in a proprietary way, but that you always have an open source option that you should fall back to, and that that would just radically upend the playing field, and that suddenly the vendors would have to be much more solicitous, much more reactive to their customers' needs, because the customers would have that ability to switch if they needed to.
David, I'm curious in your perspective, because Apcera does participate in open source groups, but you also have a lot of proprietary technology that you depend upon.
Well, I was going to say there are two things that makes me think of about the tyranny of choice. The first thing I want to say is, if you're talking about the sort of like how healthy is the ecosystem, to my mind, that's like asking the same question is, how are things going in the Coliseum today? You know, like are the battles good? Are the things that you see interesting in there? You know, like are the new weapons being introduced?
What's your bet on the line, right?
Yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. So I think there's that, but I guess to directly go to the lock-in stuff, I think that we're moving to a place where lock-in is starting to become a little less concerning to me, because I think that we have all figured out that things like APIs and writing to APIs instead of writing to a platform per se can be a useful way of giving some sort of portability. So we put a lot of emphasis on having a really good API. Kubernetes is a phenomenal API, so does Cloud Foundry. I mean, so if you looked at any of us and you said, show me your API documentation, every one of us will drop the stack on your desk that gives you a good understanding. And if you're writing to a higher level versus towards a product, I think that that helps a lot in lock-in.
Abby, I'm curious from the Cloud Foundry perspective, because one of the things that's interesting about Cloud Foundry is you guys actually abstract quite a bit, right? You actually make choices for the end user to help them, develop what they're building, to help them build things, right? So I'm curious on that. There's a certain aspect of lock-in there too, but there's also kind of like it makes it kind of less susceptible for the user to be victim of this tyranny of choice.
Well, yeah, I mean, the difference with Cloud Foundry versus, say, like CNCF's vision is that Cloud Foundry is a structured platform. It is pulling all of those pieces and functionality you need into a single deployment. The value is, obviously portability is key to our messaging, because you can run Cloud Foundry on any cloud, public or private. The abstraction, it is high degrees of abstraction and automation, with the intent of really solving one problem. And I think that's a lot of what we're all kind of here to solve the same problem, is how do you get code into production faster? That's pretty much it. That's the whole promise of Cloud Foundry, is how do you get, as a developer, code into production as fast as possible. And that's all we spend time on. How do we automate more? How do we abstract more? How do we bring more into the technology so that at the end of the day, as a developer, you can self-provision and deploy faster?
So I probably should have had this conversation with you without us being mic'd up, but I was just at a bar last night chatting with
It's all great conversations.
Yes, I'll thank CoreOS for their event. And we were talking about the right metaphor to use for PaaS versus cloud native and IaaS. And I'll just put my cards on the table that I am a massive fan of PaaS, which Cloud Foundry is one of the best known. Heroku really popularized it in 2009, but this concept that having, if you want to put blinders on, or that limiting the developers what they can do to essentially push them or force them into using best practices produces better apps, more maintainable, more deliverable, all those things. I've lived it myself. For the Linux Foundation, I actually just helped the Core Infrastructure Initiative deliver an app called the Best Practices Badge app that I'd urge you all to look at, that's for evaluating open source projects and looking at the quality. We deployed that on Heroku. It's just a great, very simple Ruby app. So I love PaaS. I was saying that the metaphor I don't like is training wheels, because that implies that eventually you want to grow out of them. And I think if any given company, the vast majority of applications they deploy, 80% or more, should always stay in the PaaS, that's exactly where they want to be. But I was wondering, maybe as a different metaphor, the difference between a tablet and a laptop. And saying a tablet is fundamentally limited, that the apps there's just a limit to what they're going to do or how you interact with it. But for instance, for my father-in-law, when I got rid of his computer and gave him a tablet, and email was reliable and he wasn't getting viruses and everything just worked so much better, as opposed to some users, like a lot of folks in this room, who need more power and want to be able to go in underneath and access some of the other capabilities.
I would argue that there's a bit of a difference, although Apple might disagree about it. I think they swear the iPad Pro is going to replace your laptop. But I would argue a little bit differently, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of feature functionality that you need as a developer to get your code out the door. And oftentimes, and particularly in enterprises with legacy, traditional infrastructure, and traditional frameworks and organizations, that involves a lot of people. There's a lot of gates, there's someone that there's change control, there's someone that has to allocate the infrastructure, the servers, the VMs, the containers, the networking, the firewall. All of that becomes this burden that has to be carried every time you want to push to production. And if you are an enterprise that is saying, I'm deploying code every 18 months, but I want to be like Amazon and deploy code every 7 minutes. And you're like, great. And technology is a great enabler of that, but it's also a process change. And we talk about CI/CD and pipelines and test-driven development and 12-factor apps and microservices and all of those things. So I think it becomes inherent to say, how much of that burden do you want to take on and own and maintain? And how much do you want to extract and automate as much as possible to get back to what is the actual outcome you want, which is, I want my code in production faster.
We have a question over here.
And can I just say one brief thing before the question? I guess I want to say that I'm totally down with what Abby's saying. I think, to my mind, Dan, that we move past the land of PaaS as here is the way we're going to force you to do the right thing, to what can we create that allows you, that as a side effect of what you do, the best practices flow easy. So it's easier to do the things that are best practices. It's easy, it's easier to have really good abstractions for how you think about stuff. And I think that we're now past that the opinionated platform days to the when I submit something into my system, it does the right thing, and then we're all happy by default. And I think that's a really good thing. And to the original question about how do you choose in this tyranny, is that part of the thing you want to look at is how well does whatever it is you're considering mesh in with your corporate structure, your corporate infrastructure, the way your culture, because you could say I'd like here's a square peg, here's a round hole, and I've got a lot of time to pound it really hard, with a lot of money. But I think that's a bad way of going forward. So looking at stuff that can come in the door and be accepted by people where there isn't a forcing function going on, I think is another good way to look at to evaluate things.
Great.
Hey, Sarah, this is Matt.
Hey, Matt.
You know that already. I was curious if you could go into that question that you started, the composability element. We jumped right past the definition of composability, and I'm really curious as we talk about container runtimes, like what does it mean to be composable, and what's the right balance between, opinion and friction versus functionality?
Ooh, okay.
And you can pass it off to your neighbors as well.
Please jump in.
No, go get them.
All right, under the bus I go. So to me, composability is options to choose the best technology for your use case. Now, composability can include full stacks, full opinionated stacks. So you can potentially compose Cloud Foundry as a pass in your infrastructure, in your enterprise, that you use for, say, the 80% of your apps that are super simple and clean and actually make your life easier by doing it this way. And then you may also compose with a chunk of Kubernetes, or I'm going to say it, some Mesos, or some, I know, or some.
Harsh.
I am very much a big tent open source
Docker
person.
Swarm.
Docker Swarm. I'll
Yeah.
even say Docker
Docker
Swarm.
Engine.
Thank you, Docker
Yeah.
Engine.
Yeah,
Docker
good.
Engine is an important part of this. All of these pieces fit together and offer different things to different people. So we know of organizations that use Mesos and DCOS, but use a Kubernetes scheduler in it in order to schedule the containers and the orchestration on top of Mesos. And to me, this is composability. This is finding ways and finding edges and APIs and strong contracts, interfaces between the software pieces that then allow the end users to get their needs best met in the easiest way for them to support. So in a lot of cases, in smaller enterprises, maybe you'll find that this is an opinionated stack. This is something that ends up looking as if it's more of a cookie cutter deployment. In a larger enterprise, you'll have multiple different opportunities or ways to move to a cloud native infrastructure because you'll have different needs for different applications. But to me, the composability is about making sure that these pieces work well together and that there are interfaces so that your needs as an end user are met. Does that answer your question, Matt? Yes. Enough. Anyway, you weren't listening. Does anyone want to add anything?
I want to say hell yeah.
It's
hell
Pancake
yeah.
Robots.
Oh, we got a hell yeah.
Hell yeah. I think that is exactly, and I tell the exact same story. I think it's the answer is, or I usually say yes and.
Yes.
Yes
Please.
and.
We're done. All right.
Let's take a quick break for a message about our sponsor. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation is driving adoption of a new computing paradigm that is optimized for modern distributed systems environments, including container packaged, dynamically scheduled, and microservices-based application development operations. You can learn more at cncf.io. That's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at cncf.io. Now, let's get back to the show.
Joe has a question.
Oh, yeah, terrific. I guess a question for both Abby and Dan primarily. You both have a lot of, large IT vendors who are participating in the process. How do you avoid the pitfalls that standards bodies in the past have fallen to? I'm thinking web services, but others as well, where vendors tend to act more in their own self-interest, and then when things aren't going quickly, they may actually actively sabotage the progress of a new set of standards. I mean, how do you avoid that now?
Well, I think our problems are a little bit different. So from Cloud Foundry is a very unique open source foundation to begin with, because we kind of started fully formed. So, for those of you who don't know, Cloud Foundry became officially open source under the LF in January of 2015. And it kind of really started with fully formed with the code, with a core membership out the door. But yeah, I will say right now we're at 64 members, most of which, as you pointed out, are enterprise or large organizations. And the beautiful thing I think about Cloud Foundry and the brilliance of having the structure we have with it combined with open source is that we have a business governance body and we have a technical governance body. Mm-hmm. And we really work actively to keep those fundamentals separate and making sure that people have a voice, but there is a direction and there is buy-in from both the business side as well as the technology side. And we work to make sure that everyone's best interests continue to be met while keeping with a cohesive vision and a cohesive strategy. And when we introduced certified platforms last year, that's also really helped. Because going back to the portability and the avoiding vendor lock-in, what you don't want to have is a Cloud Foundry and 12 different flavors of Cloud Foundry. So we work to make sure that core Elastic Runtime, when you say it's Cloud Foundry, is the same Cloud Foundry. So we have a certification process now, and that goes to really reinforce behavior. So going back to how do you keep people in line and saying, well, if you're a certified platform, that means you're maintaining the code and you're up to date. And when you say it's Cloud Foundry, it's the same version. And we use that to kind of keep consistency alongside the vision.
So I'll second the part about separating the business board from the technology group. And that's, I really think, one of the biggest core lessons that the Linux Foundation has discovered. And I helped set up the Modern Linux Foundation back in 2006 when we had this technical advisory board and of kernel developers wasn't really being used very much, and kind of put that together, and we've now replicated that across all the different groups. But there is another takeaway that I have. So I've also been pretty involved in the Internet Engineering Task Force over time, and I have enormous amounts of respect. Obviously, all of our lives, all the technologies we're doing is really dependent on that I saw a comment at some point saying, yeah, Tim Berners-Lee invented the web. That didn't even come out of IETF. What did they ever do for us? And the response was, well, other than TCP/IP, DNS, and MIME, what was there really? But it is interesting to think that all those were really developed in the context of closed source proprietary software vendors that were getting together to agree how to interoperate. Mm-hmm. And that was a radically different world than the one that we live in today. And what I really see us doing up here is a new form, and in particular the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Our goal is to try and look at the IETF and the Apache Software Foundation, Cloud Foundry, and OpenStack and others, and try to not repeat any of their mistakes and make entirely new mistakes of our own. But as an example of that I think is actually pretty powerful, if you look at our members and our end users that are, for example, deploying Kubernetes or deploying Prometheus today, they're not taking that software and then doing their little proprietary add-ons to it and their little tweaks and such. Almost to 100%, they are working off of master. And that includes the GKE service from Google, where I think it's like 2 weeks after it ships. That is the software that you're using. And so when anybody sees a bug, when anyone has a problem, that is getting contributed upstream. There's a whole consensus process of how it gets included. Everyone gets that. And you can also see it in the history of the Linux kernel, where people remember the battle days of, it was like 2.6 something, where SUSE and Red Hat had this big sort of battle among enterprise customers where they were bragging about who was carrying better patch sets. And oh, we're carrying it for this chipset, and oh, we fixed it. And they looked at this and said, it's so expensive, let's just get all this upstream and not brag or argue about how different our kernels are from the upstream kernel, that the value here is on the support and the services alongside that. And so I do think that we have a new model that we're developing here that has some real strength
David,
to it.
I'd like to, David, then maybe Sarah. You know, I'm curious from your perspective, like how you guys, what's your philosophy here? You know, as related to, for example, image formats and runtimes, right? There's a lot of discussion going on right now about the actual image format, what it should be, and what the runtime should look like. And so, I mean, but you guys are mostly a proprietary organization, but these are important considerations.
Yeah, so yes, we do sell a core product, and that stuff is proprietary, but it does have components to it that are open source, that are freely available. NATS was mentioned before, which is this really cool secure message bus that's super easy to set up. But we also, when we come to image formats, we also kind of like making sure that we're keeping up with the standards. So, for example, we have open sourced a runtime called Kerma, which is implementing some of the newer standards, and that's the thing that's going to be running the stuff in the proprietary thing. So we're down with that. I don't have much to add to these folks because they were so eloquent in that regard. So I want to, if you could ask your question in the form of a question, I will. I will gladly.
Or I can just jump in.
Yeah, you can just jump in. Go for it. Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah.
So I'll jump in for this in a couple of different ways. So I actually participate in the OCI on the trademark board and the eventual certification working, or the certification working group for eventual certification. And to Dan's point, doing open source and defining standards together is very different from pulling together a bunch of proprietary solutions and trying to find standards and overlap. Open source has moved a lot faster than the enterprise or the large-scale closed source products ever did. And that has caused a really interesting tension between choosing a standard and using that standard to both move an ecosystem and encourage innovation outside of the original founding group for the standard. In this case, it's sort of the Docker image for the OCI image, as the OCI image base for the specification. So if we codify that standard too early, we decrease potential innovation from some spaces, but increase potential innovation around that. So trying to balance that tension in the public in a gracious and open and collaborative manner is really fascinating, and it's really hard to do well, and I think that the OCI is doing a very good job of it. I think that there is a lot of discussion about how to balance these two competing tensions. We need a standard, and it will happen at some point. Who will participate in the standard, how the standard will be evolved, and what that standard will look like on what timeline are all things that we're still pulling on. There's a big 2-hour development meeting coming up from the OCI at 9 o'clock, and all of these development meetings happen in the public. There's generally, I think it's a bi-weekly call that happens around the development group, and trying to get to what is the right balance there is super important. We also talked a little bit about how to find the edges and how to agree on things in an open source world. Kubernetes being a distributed or a platform for distribution of containers and orchestration of containers really needed to move to a model of distributed decision making. We've all seen for the last 30 odd years how Conway's law affects what happens in our software and how our software affects our organizational groups. When I was brought into Google to talk, to speak to the community and help move Kubernetes from a company-led project to a community-led project and move it into a foundation, one of the first things I was incredibly pleased to see was that Kubernetes had not been designed with a benevolent dictator for life at the top. There was a decentralized, Google kind of figures this out by consensus model inside Google. And we had to figure out a way to generalize that to include developers and opinions from the community. And we've had great partners in Red Hat and CoreOS and Huawei. working on this since its inception and all through the last year, 2 years of development on it. So finding this new model of where are the edges, how do we integrate, what are the interoperability points, what are the standards, what are the strong contracts, in a way that is collaborative and doesn't get into the vendor wars of earlier eras is something that I think we see as the open source culture is more accepted in technology, and I think that that's super
We
important.
do have a question. We do want to make sure we get it in.
Can I
Oh,
take-
yep.
I'm sorry, can I
John.
tag on one
Yeah,
second?
hold on, just hold on.
Good.
Hi, John Belmark from Infoblox. One of the things we're doing is we're building out a SaaS offering, so of course we're building out a whole control plane and everything using a lot of these technologies. And in the future, we're thinking we may want to offer that as an on-prem solution as well. But as we talk to some of our leading customers that are leading technologically, they've asked us, they've said, well, rather than, we already have a control plane. We don't really want to deploy your control plane on for your system. We just want to consume your containers and put it into our control plane. So we've talked here about runtime, and image formats, but I think in order to do something like that, you need a standard about how the different parts of the application and how these dozens of different images and containers can interoperate and what needs to talk to what. And is CNCF or anybody else looking at some standards or formats for defining that sort of application manifest?
I want to ask you, David, do you have any perspective on that? And you can add anything else.
Yeah,
like
so
that.
let me back up for a second, and then I'm going to answer your question. Sarah was kind enough to say really cool things, which got my second neuron to fire.
Good morning.
So I just wanted to say that so yeah, exactly, it's that morning thing. And so I just want to say that, like, I realized that we were talking, like, AppSera is one of the founding members of OCI. Like, we very much wanted, I think that it's a model that we're talking about here, that Abby's talked about, where it's possible to bring in, where vendors can be participating in open standards processes because we know it's important and good for us as well in the commercial world. So your question was around, is there going to be standardization around description of applications or application contexts and things like that? And you're seeing some of that. I mean, sometimes you're seeing it because one project, cough, cough, Docker, is pushing, to help define some of that sort of stuff. And I think that everybody has figured out that one of the new frontiers is how do we all talk about applications with a common language, or we're all going to make a run at this, where it's composed of things like microservices and containers, which gets us in the CNCF ballpark. So I think for sure, I know that we're working on stuff with other people, that this is one of the things in the Coliseum that I think is actively being discussed.
Great. Dan, any last thoughts? And then finish up with Abby?
No, I'll pass.
Great. Any last thoughts, Abby?
Microservices, all the things, right? Isn't that
Microservices,
All the
Docker,
things.
Docker, deploy.
Excellent. Well, we'll end it right there. I do want to thank again CNCF and AppSera for sponsoring this breakfast. Thank you guys very much. Pancake Robot's very happy to be here, and we're all happy as well. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the conference. And one last thing, there's more pancakes tomorrow. So come and join us if you like for more pancakes.
The New Stacks Pancake Breakfast from ContainerCon is brought to you by AppSera and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. The AppSera Trusted Cloud Platform is a highly secure, policy-driven multi-cloud platform for cloud-native applications, containers, microservices, and legacy applications. AppSera enables developers and DevOps teams to use any modern tool or software they want while giving IT and operations teams the assurance that their infrastructure is safe and secure. You can learn more at appsera.com. That's AppSera.com. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation is driving adoption of a new computing paradigm that is optimized for modern distributed systems environments, including container packaged, dynamically scheduled, and microservices-based application development operations. You can learn more at cncf.io. That's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at cncf.io. Thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.